So tonight, it's a real pleasure to be here in Köln, and I had to come up with a name for the lecture, which would be maybe about Rotterdam. And I thought there's actually no better fitting title than No Words But Deeds. And No Words But Deeds is actually a very typical Rotterdam saying. As you can see here, tattooed on the arm of a football hooligan fan. In Dutch it's geen woorden maar daden. And I think it's a very important expression for Rotterdam, because it's a city that really defines itself as a city of doing. Of course, it is the second biggest city in the Netherlands, the biggest city being Amsterdam. And Amsterdam is always considered to be the city of glamour and splendor, but also the city of talking and of arrogance. And Rotterdam is the city of the labor, of the harbor laborers, but also the city of doing and acting. And I think it actually fits quite well to my own person, even though I must admit I had periods in my life that I was more thinking than doing. But I must say my main driver has always been to get things done. In my lecture today, I will actually take you along a little bit in my biography and then speak mainly about the Rotterdam projects we are currently engaged in. So just to give you a bit of background, I was born in the mid-70s, and I went to school in the technical school, Fachhochschule in Amsterdam. And during my studies in Amsterdam, I also studied 1 year in Frankfurt on the Fachhochschule. That's where I learned my excellent German. And after that, actually, I went to study at the Beitrag Institute in Rotterdam, which at the time was still a very, you could say, experimental school. And it was a very big contrast to the very practical training I had at the Fachhochschule. And I worked in the Beitrag, I worked with people such as Wiel Arets, Nieuwe Maas, Stefan Boeri, but also Rem Koolhaas, who was one of my teachers. And actually, Rem Koolhaas asked me to come and work for him for his think tank called ehemaligen. And I worked there for 2 years. Now, I know you've had a lecture by Floris Altomane a few weeks ago. I actually also worked together with Floris. But I was always working a lot more on the think tank part. So this was actually the part where I was thinking more than doing, you could say. And what I did there, I wrote quite a few articles. I did some very large-scale research studies. Amongst others, a study into what's called the Holocore or the Eurocore, which is actually defined as this kind of area we are right now in, which is this kind of urban field in the middle of Europe, which Rem Koolhaas identified as a kind of totally different urban situation than the big metropolitan cities around it. So, as opposed to London and Paris and Berlin, which are really multi-million agglomerations which have a really strong central identity, you could say the Eurocore is basically a collection of cities, a kind of huge urban sprawl that combines no city larger than 1 million people. And basically together they are 32 million. And that kind of particular condition is what I worked on for 1 year to describe that and to research that. And it was actually parallel to the Zollverein, which was being built at the time. So after these 2 years at OME, I was actually really quite anxious to start doing again. And I was also quite tired of working 100 hours a week at Koolhaas' office. So I founded Powerhouse Company, at that time together with my friend Charles Bessard, who was from Denmark. And we had an office in 2 countries. And at the time, all the Dutch offices had really short names, like Next Architects, Dus Architects, Must, MVRDV. So when we had to come up with a name for our office, we thought, let's make a really long name, let's make a really long name. So we came up with the idea to call the company Powerhouse Fortune Company. But that was a bit ridiculous because we were broke, So we left out the fortune and we called it Powerhouse Company. Now, Powerhouse is, of course, the meaning of a very ambitious and hard-working team, to be a powerhouse. And company stands for the idea to collaborate, to work together, not only with architects in the office, but also together with your clients and with different partners. And that's how we set off. And we were kind of very lucky that we got a fantastic first commission for a villa, and for me it was a fantastic time. I was able to use all my knowledge from the Fachhochschule in crafting and drafting this first project, and we won a lot of prizes with it. And it was for me a fantastic way to return to architecture as an active deed of doing after, let's say, 4 years of mainly thinking and writing and doing very large schemes. So in the beginning of the office in 2005, the economic momentum was quite good, and after our first villa, we got another villa as a client. So we were going quite well until, of course, in 2008, the entire economy collapsed. And what was for us quite shocking as architects was that we discovered that after the bankers, the architects were also fired. So the two biggest groups of people that were being fired were the bankers and the architects. And for me it was really kind of an awakening, like, how come architecture is so closely related to finance? Like, I never learned anything about finance in architecture school, because in architecture school I mainly learned about architecture. So what I did is I kind of retreated again back into thinking, and I started to research, actually 2 researches, which were both kind of based on the idea of trying to uncover what is the relationship between finance and architecture. And one was called Ehemaligen, which was basically about the speculative nature of real estate. And the other one was called Shifts, which is basically about the changing position of the architect in, let's say, the new economic reality. And on both these projects we worked together with Hans Ibelings, who is a great writer and an editor, and that was a fantastic project to work on. And besides writing text, we also made collages and, of course, models. So this is one of the collages we made about the speculation of real estate. But we also made a lot of physical models that try to explain the relationship between economy and real estate. So for instance, one of the models we made was all the economic bubbles of the last 200 years in scale comparison. And you can see the bubble on the top is actually the bubble of the 2008 crash. And it just shows the enormity of the real estate market imploding. Another model which we made, which I think is still very active today, is this model where you see on the front, you see these figures. Basically, that is the rising average wage in Europe, and you can see that it's not really rising, it's extremely stable. And in the back you see the housing prices going up and down. And you can see in some countries that the housing prices are going up a lot faster than the wages. And this simply means that in some cases, as was also in the last few years, actually houses were making more money than the people living in it. So people could go to work, but the houses stayed at home, and they made more money in a year than you did as a worker. So these mechanisms were for me extremely interesting to uncover, this kind of relationship between finance and architecture, and also you could say the almost paradoxical relationship. And at the same time in the office we really try to keep on working and try to basically build as much as we can. So one of the projects we did at that period was, for instance, this extension of a shopping mall from the 60s, which was a job that we were very eager to do, because I was also eager to actually explore commercial architecture. But as we did this design, it was for me very fascinating that we were only allowed to design facade, and we were not even allowed to communicate with the contractor about the way it was being built. So it was actually, you could say, extremely uncoupled experience, as an architect. It was definitely not as integrated as the villas we were doing. Talking about villas, in that same period we got another commission for a villa in Munich, and that was built over the course of 3 years. And this villa was, you could say, a total Gesamtkunstwerk, where we were able to detail almost everything in the building. This building in Munich is on the front facade, the building is entirely made of marble, as you can see. But these louvers, as you can see, can also open and close automatically. The doors were, of course, entirely custom made. Here you can see all the sliding panels and all the windows, meticulously detailed. And of course here you can see that our love for detailing and engineering is extremely present. But these kind of projects are the projects where as an architect you can fully manifest all your, let's say, design desires without being interfered by the kind of cruel logic of the marketplace. So, as beautiful and as nice as it is to build these buildings, of course, for me it's also very much kind of a niche within architecture that I very much enjoy doing and building. But at the same time, I also believe that architects are generalists and should generally be able to build any type of building. So even though it was for us, let's say, relatively easy to keep on working only in the villa department, we were always really pushing to do other types of buildings. Now the next building, one of the next buildings we did, which was for us a very big step, is when we won the competition for the Fachhochschule in Amsterdam. Actually, it was the school where I went to school myself. It was a competition that we won to design the new building. And I was extremely excited because I thought, well, this is the first public commission. And I thought, well, now that we win it, we will probably immediately have a meeting with the director of the school, with the dean, to talk about his ideas about education, to see how we can use architecture to improve technical education. But the irony of that building was that, I can talk shortly about it. It's actually, the plot is right here, it's right in front of these two buildings. The building on the left is a building that everybody loves in Amsterdam, and the building on the right is a building that everybody hates in Amsterdam. And the funny thing is that the building on the right is an extension by the architect that used to work for the architect of the building on the left. So there's, people say, a little Oedipus thing going on there. And what we basically did is that we built this building in front of it, and by building in front of it, we were also able to create a new atrium inside, which was able to use the facade of the building that everybody hates as a new interior facade. But for me, the interesting thing about this project is not so much about the architecture, but what I want to speak about is the fact that it took almost 3 years for us to speak to the director of the school. Because the first meetings we had were with the facility manager and with the financial manager of the school. And all the meetings we had in all the technical phases were only about the real estate logic of the school. So it was all about square meters per students, the size of the classrooms, the amount of money being spent on these students. And for me, it really led to a larger research where I started to see what is this public client actually about? Do we still have public clients in the Netherlands? And what I discovered is that in the past, of course, we had public clients, for schools or for universities or for museums or for libraries. But more and more, these public clients were treating all their projects as if they were commercial real estate projects. Now, this is a graph showing the government expenditure on culture and art. And in the Netherlands also we had a populist government, so we had massive budget cuts on culture and art. And it led to this kind of moment where I really started to think about this kind of reality that is surrounding us, which is, you could say, the hardcore neoliberal reality, which is also, let's say, the case in Europe in general, where culture and architecture is more and more swallowed by the commercial domain and not so much anymore part of the welfare state. You could say that for me it was clear that the role of the architect is diminishing in this kind of neoliberal world, this increasingly capitalist world we're living in, whether we like it or not. In that world, the role of the architect is becoming smaller and smaller, and architecture as an act of building the larger environment is now really becoming dependent on the main global capital flows. So investors from all over the world are investing in cities, and this is really shaping a lot of the way we design and master plan our cities. And I think for me it was also clear that architects are not really invited to discuss the business case that underlies real estate projects. So we are there mainly to design the business case without really knowing what it is all about. And you could see this on a lot of levels. I think what I discussed earlier, I also think in the area of museums, for instance, more and more museums are now private museums. There's an incredible rise of private museums, such for instance the one by Louis Vuitton in Paris, by Frank Gehry. And globally, this is a phenomenon. In the Netherlands, we've had over the last 20 years, we've added, I think, 6 or 7 private museums. And in the world, this is on a global scale happening. So you could say, you could really ask the question as an architect, at least that's what I'm trying to do, is whose city is this? You know, and as an architect, who are your clients, and how can you really engage, and how can you really influence this kind of economical agenda? So what we did at that time is that, kind of counterintuitive, I started to develop buildings myself as an architect, purely because I was fascinated about empty buildings and trying to make a change. So one of the buildings we started with is actually this office building from the 70s. It was abandoned by the government, and they wanted to sell it, but nobody wanted to buy it, so it had been empty for quite a long time. It was a kind of semi-brutalist building with quite fantastic views, and at the same time also quite a difficult structure, but really quite beautiful details in it. So what I tried to do is to try to find a way to buy that building and then to transform it into apartments. So what I managed to do is that I asked the government whether I could buy it from them, but I would only pay it once I changed the zoning law. And they gave me 2 years to do that, and in those 2 years I was able to change the zoning law and sell the apartments. And with that money I was able to renovate the building and of course change the plan entirely into a living and housing plan. And what we did, for instance, was to mix smaller apartments with larger apartments, which is an interesting thing that the real estate broker said, yeah, you shouldn't really make smaller and bigger apartments mixed, because then you have people with less money mixed with people with more money, and it will create problems. But, well, I said, I think it's actually nice to mix them. I think it makes sense. So, and he also said the bigger apartments, you probably won't sell them. The funny thing was the bigger apartments we sold immediately, the smaller ones as well, actually. And we managed to actually sell all the apartments and transform this old office building into a new residential building. And then on top of it, as you can see, I built a house for myself, because that was of course also one of the secret agendas, was to build a fantastic penthouse on top of the roof. So that was my house, that's my house on top of the roof. And this was my first experience with project development, which I really liked a lot, because all of a sudden I was doing a commercial project, but I was also in charge of it, you know. So I was able to really think about qualities of mixing smaller and larger apartments. I was able to think where I want to invest in, what qualities do I want to create. At the same time, at that time, I was also director of the Beitrag in Delft, which is a postgraduate school, which is also a school I went to myself, so it was actually very nice to come back and be the director of the school. But since the Beitrag is also an accredited institute, after 3 years it became clear to me that working in an academic environment is really quite frustrating, because it's extremely pre-programmed according to the accreditation committees. Well, I guess a lot of the teachers here will probably, professors here will probably acknowledge that. It's always quite a struggle to find your way in these quite hardcore accreditation committees. So after 3 years, I was doubting whether to renew my term. And since I had just done this first development project, I thought, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't extend my term for another 3 years, but maybe I should just become a project developer and start a new company. That felt honestly a bit like making a large jump, because of course developers are generally seen as the kind of born evil. But I thought it could be very interesting to try to do that, and to try to create a firm which would develop in a different way, more from a cultural perspective and also more from an architectural perspective, and try to densify the city in that way. So I was very happy at that time. I was working with a young developer called Niels Janssen. He was actually my client. He was extremely driven and extremely knowledgeable, and what I did, I simply asked him whether he wanted to start a development company with me, because developing with an architecture firm is a very different situation. So we created two different firms, and that's how we created RED Company, which means Real Estate Development Company, which, you know, speaks for itself. Of course, there's few examples of architects that also develop. This is one of my favorites. If you don't know him, you should really look him up. His name is John Portman. He's from America. He was a developer from the 70s onwards, an architect turned developer, and he developed really huge hotels, fantastic shopping malls, and he was quite inventive. For instance, the hotel on the right, which is the Marriott Hotel in San Francisco, had this massively huge atrium, which became extremely popular. At that time, all the developers thought he was doing something extremely stupid because he was building this huge atrium. And he said, what's the use of this huge atrium? But of course, as a space, it's fantastic, and it still is a fantastic space. It's a kind of ruthless building. And it became a wildly popular model for hotels in the 70s. So that company was basically an attempt to work with that model to see how I could mobilize, let's say, attraction on the financial business case, and then also create architecture and try to do it at the same time. So when we founded Red Company, we were at the forefront in 2015. It was just starting to, let's say, start a whole new wave of investments into real estate. And this is what you can see, the investment volume in the Netherlands, and you can see it going up. So we were quite at the right moment to start that. And we also started that in Rotterdam, which you could say is in itself also the most real estate driven city in the Netherlands. So I don't know if you ever went to Rotterdam, but Rotterdam is a port city, and it was entirely bombed in the war by the Germans. And interesting enough, not only did they bomb it, but also the Dutch city government at the time, the Rotterdam city government, decided to also demolish then almost the entire inner city, because they were very interested in the idea of creating a modern heart for the city. Now, if you look at Rotterdam nowadays, which is, let's say, the current state of affairs, I think there's a few interesting things to notice. Of course, you can see that Rotterdam is very much based on the modernist planning principles. You can see in the front here these slabs. These are the Lijnbaan slabs, which was a combination of housing and shopping from the 60s. You can see there the old city hall. You can of course also see all the towers, which I will speak about a lot today. But I think what's also very interesting, if you look at it from the point of view of a real estate developer, that if you look at the financing of all these buildings, so who are the investors in all these buildings, who are the banks financing all these buildings, then it's quite interesting that about 60% of the city center of Rotterdam is financed by German banks, which, you know, considering the fact that it was bombed in the war, I still find that a kind of fascinating paradox, you know, that the Germans are still present in a particular way. So Rotterdam redefined itself as a modern city, and it's also redefined itself as a high-rise city. Now, Rotterdam was the first city in the Netherlands to create a kind of high-rise policy. And, you know, I think that's quite interesting to speak about, like how did they do that? And what is interesting is that Rotterdam really defined areas where densification by high-rise is allowed. And they defined all these areas where you can build towers. And these are basically along the main streets and main roads of Rotterdam. And also in the areas where in the 60s they built mainly shopping and offices and actually quite little housing. Interesting enough, the city center of Rotterdam has actually quite a limited amount of housing because of the modernist planning. There were a lot of offices planned. So this whole policy is updated quite regularly, and it describes all the different facets of the Rotterdam urban structure. So basically you have the 19th century housing, which is, let's say, maximum 20 meter high, which is the red part. then it has the until 50 meter high part until the 60s, and then it goes up from there into, let's say, the early 80s and 90s until the 2000s now. And it's really trying to create this mixed skyline of all these different sorts of architectures that are there in Rotterdam. And it looks at towers as two particular parts. One as an idea of an object in the skyline. So basically, you could say from a city level. And in the 80s, there were also, you could say, a lot of mistakes made with that. So these are examples that the city of Rotterdam uses how not to do high-rises, which is also interesting. Like Rotterdam the planning department is evaluating its own result of their own planning policy all the time. But then what it's now focusing on a lot is how the city looks at eye level. So basically the policy now says that if you want to build a tower, you can only do that if you really create a livable city at eye level. And that means that all the technical spaces need to be underground, all the parking needs to be underground. On the ground level they want basically shopping activities or people living there so that there's really a contact with the street. And that's actually a very important rule. Another thing they did is that they defined public areas in the city where they want to keep a certain amount of sun and where you cannot add more shadow. So it's actually a very interesting principle. They're called sunspots. And all these areas are, let's say, the main public spaces. And whatever tower you design or add is not allowed to add more shadow than a certain amount, which you can see on the right. And then, of course, there's the whole idea about wind as well. The way the wind behaves around towers is also researched a lot in Rotterdam. And it's used to, let's say, define an idea of setbacks. So the towers always step back to a certain amount to actually block the wind from really creating huge wind tunnels. And of course, what they're doing recently also is adding this idea of social interaction in the towers, is that you're not allowed anymore to go from the parking garage straight to your apartment. So you always have to go through the lobby, and if the tower becomes really high, you have to add another lobby so people actually have space to meet and interact. And the kind of idea of anonymous living is kind of countered with that. So basically, you could say the Rotterdam high-rise policy has really evolved a lot, and it became actually really quite a comprehensive idea on how to create sustainable towers. And what we're also doing is to basically have all these different qualities that you should consider when you're designing a tower, whether it's alternative energy sources or proximity to public transport, also inclusivity, health. All these elements are now part of the high-rise policy. Now, when we talk about high-rise, I just want to show quickly this. Like these are the high-rise of Rotterdam, and in Holland we consider every building higher than 70 meters a high-rise. Now, this is Rotterdam, and this is, let's say, Rotterdam and Europe. You can see that actually Rotterdam is not that high. And this is Rotterdam and Europe and the world, and you can see that Rotterdam is actually extremely low. So even though in Rotterdam we speak about high-rises, it's still extremely gentle, you could say. So anyway, one of the first projects we did in Rotterdam as a developer and architect was the Down Tower. We actually looked at the map of the high-rise zone, and we were looking for plots and sites that we could acquire to build a tower. And one of the first spots we found was a very small piece of land, old office building right in that area where you see the arrow. It's actually right in the center of Rotterdam, and in that area we're actually allowed to build 150 meters high. But since the site was quite small and narrow, we designed this quite slender tower there of 22 by 22 meters. Creating a very compact tower, and in the bottom making setbacks and creating a very lively plinth. And then as a main quality creating these fantastically large windows to really create amazing views over the city. Now over the last 8 years we worked on getting all the permits for this, and actually 2 weeks ago we finally started construction of that project. as you can see. And I'm super happy that we finally managed to start building this tower, which we then have designed and also developed. And it was actually, let's say, our first introduction to high-rises and the way how to integrate them into the urban fabric. And let's say a few years later, in 2018, we started working on the Rijnhaven master plan and on the Koninklijke terrain. Now, the Rijnhaven, just to give you an introduction, is actually this harbor. It's actually the Rhine harbor. And what you can see here is the one you see right in front of you, is that Rijnhaven was made in 1910. And when it was finished, it was actually the most modern harbor in the world. It was the first electrical harbor. It had the largest warehouse in the world at that time. And it was also the part of Rotterdam from which all the boats to America would leave, which meant that, for instance, people like Thomas Mann, but also Albert Einstein, left from the Rijnhaven to America. And there's still a hotel there called Hotel New York, which is a beautiful Art Deco hotel, which is built in that time, which was, let's say, the point of departure. So millions of people here from the Rijnhaven departed to America. But what I think is interesting to realize is that when you look at the center of Rotterdam, you can see all these harbors here. These are all the historical harbors here. So this is basically the origin of Rotterdam as a harbor city. And then what you can see is that when it was completed, the Rijnhaven was actually the largest harbor in a new harbor basin in Rotterdam. And of course this all used to be agricultural land here, and they dug out this harbor. And then quite shortly after they built this harbor, which was the Maashaven, which is also a very large harbor, even a lot larger than the Rijnhaven. But when you then zoom out, you see that this is the here is the Rijnhaven. You can see all these new harbors from the 60s and 70s are even bigger. And then when you zoom out, you actually see the latest harbor we added, which is the Maasvlakte, which in itself is bigger than the entire city center of Rotterdam. And it just shows you the kind of massive scale increase, that the harbor of Rotterdam has gone through over the last 100 years. Because the Rijnhaven is 110 years old, So the Rijnhaven, of course, is pretty much useless today as a harbor. It has already been since 30 years, as is also the Maashaven right next door. These harbors are still in use, and of course, all the way in the back here is the Maasvlakte. And in the 90s already, the city of Rotterdam set out to redevelop this harbor by building this Erasmus Bridge designed by Ben van Berkel, and it became a really famous icon of Rotterdam. And then in the last 25 years, all these high-rises were built on this piece of land. And this was still very much a bad area. And when they built this little bridge here, then actually this whole part was amazingly activated and now became an extremely nice area to live. And ever since, the Rotterdam municipality has been thinking about a master plan for this entire Rijnhaven, and we were closely engaged with that because as a developer we were engaged with this plot of land called the Koninklijke factory, which is the last factory still active in the Rijnhaven area. It's actually a food production factory. And because that factory is still active, it is impossible to create a loop around the harbor because this factory is still blocking the public use of this space. So the master plan that we designed over the last few years, together with the municipality, is very much an integrated effort in learning about all the lessons from the Wilhelmina Pier, which was done in the 90s, which is basically a checkerboard of very large towers that are all quite, let's say, separate from each other and also really have their own identity. Basically, they're all, you could say, ego-driven towers by the architects, because there's Foster there, there's Koolhaas here, there's Alvaro Siza here, there's Meccano there, and MVDV will running one there. So basically this is one particular way, you could say very much a 90s way of planning that part. But the municipality said, if we're going to redevelop this harbor, then we really need to make it a lot more nature-based, because at the moment it totally lacks green, it also lacks parks, it lacks also space to stay outside and to enjoy urban life. So what the municipality decided was to basically fill this part of the Rijnhaven again with land. And by filling this part of the Rijnhaven with land, they were able to create a huge park and to create spaces for more housing. And on our side of the project, we were thinking about the redevelopment of the factory area right here. And by redeveloping the factory area into housing, offices and hotels, we were able to create this urban loop around the Rijnhaven. That took, let's say, the last 4 years to do that. And in that planning area, in that planning process, you could say it's very Rotterdam oriented, so it's extremely practical driven. It was very much a process of designing, reflecting, then designing a bit more, reflecting a bit more, also interacting with the community, but also starting. And as you can see, the municipality of Rotterdam now started to reclaim this land. So these boats are basically pumping back sand to create this big park area here. It's now already under construction. It will be finished in about 1 year. And then in about 3 to 4 years, they will also start construction of the park and all the housing blocks on it, which is quite fast, you could say. And it's also very much this Rotterdam attitude of just starting to do it. So this is what the municipality and Powerhouse together designed. The idea is to create this park here with densification of office towers, of housing towers here. This is all housing. And then here around also floating parks, because the Rijnhaven is a tidal river. It's going up and down 2 meters every day. To create here these floating parks. And of course on this side we are very busy with the redevelopment of the Codico factory. And I'll speak more about the floating office later. So this is then the idea, the master plan as it is now, let's say, agreed on by the municipality and became the new zoning law. So this will be, let's say, the plan that will be executed within the next 10 years. And as you can see, the park is already starting to build. These towers, of course, all need to be designed. And we started to work on the redesign of this whole factory area. So central to that factory area is actually, of course, this factory, which, as you can see, is a functioning factory. Actually, they're producing food products. So all the stuff that goes into to chips and crackers and so on, all the kind of bulk product. And part of the building is a national monument, this part, and a part of this actually not. So we were able to also reuse parts of it. And what you can see about the factory is that it was built in the 50s, right after the war, as a kind of cooperative factory for flour. I love this picture because you can really feel the kind of harbor activity that it had at the point. Of course, it was extremely busy harbor. And the building itself was designed by Jo Vechter, and as I said, it's a national monument. And what is quite beautiful about it is that it is extremely functional, this building, and at the same time it's extremely poetic in the way that each part is designed. So every part is designed from a very functional point of view, but because of all the different functions, the building still has extremely strong expression, such as, for instance, of course, this fantastic glass cube here on the roof, which, you know, I think most architecture students living in Rotterdam have all driven past that glass cube and have fantasized about maybe making a house out of it or maybe making offices out of it. So, of course, we were very happy to be able to work on that project together with the owner of the factory to redevelop it into housing. So this is what we have been designing over the last few years, and it's been really extremely close interaction with the municipality on one hand keeping the monument, and at the same time adding different housing blocks, and of course also one tower, because it's also an area that is very much in need of densification. It's also one of the poorest areas in Rotterdam. Rotterdam is also one of the poorest cities in the Netherlands. And the idea is also to really give that part of the city also its own, let's say, iconic marker. So for this project as a developer, we also worked with other architects, which for me was also a new chapter. So for this tower, we hired shop architects from New York to design that tower, also because of the proximity to the Hotel New York building, which of course I think is a very interesting link, because there's such a strong link between New York and Rotterdam, not only because of the high rise, but also because of the fact that most Europeans that went to New York departed from Rotterdam. And shop architects designed this tower, and the factory itself was being renovated by Winhof architects, and then we invited Meccano architects to design this floating pavilion in the Rijnhaven. So all this is now being approved by the City Council within the next 2 weeks. And as you can see, it will create a really different atmosphere once it will be finished, because the old harbor, the old factory will be reused. We will add new housing and hotels and workspaces and also cultural functions in that area to really create a new city center for Rotterdam. And it was also, it's a really kind of search on the right way to introduce architecture into this in this project, because when you work with monuments, it's always a question: do you really want to confront it with a totally different language, or do you want to design with let's say in harmony with the language of the monument? So this is now the designs that we are making, and it's really turning, I think, into a very interesting unity of objects. And also I think it will be very interesting that finally this factory space, which is now a totally private area where you can actually never walk, will become a totally accessible area. So this is basically the future view of the project, how it will look like in, I think, about 10 years, let's say. And it will really become one of the new city centers in Rotterdam, which you know, is interesting because Rotterdam is also a city, because of the center being destroyed, that doesn't really have a heart. It has different areas of intensity, you could say, and the Rijnhaven is one of them. Now, within the Rijnhaven, we also designed the floating office. The floating office was actually a very strange commission, because it was initiated by Ban Ki-moon from the United Nations, who founded the Global Central Adaptation, which is basically the idea that because we are living in a time of climate change, we also need to spend research and time and money on how to adapt to climate change. Of course, we need to stop climate change, but we also need to adapt to climate change. At least that was the idea from Ban Ki-moon. And the Dutch president then said, okay, we will house the headquarters of the GCA in Holland. And then the mayor of Rotterdam said, and then we will house it in Rotterdam, and we will make a floating office. Of course, they had no idea how to do that, so since we were working on the factory, they asked us whether we could come up with an idea. And it also had to be done very fast. We had to build this within 1.5 years. So it's again a very good example of no words but deeds. It was very simple. Mr. Ban Ki-moon, you're going to have a floating office, and it will be done in 1.5 years. And we started thinking, how do we do that? So, because of course, you know, when you build a floating office, it also has to fit through this bridge. So whatever you design, it has to be able to fit through this bridge. So what we did first is to think about the right way to build the foundation for this floating office. And the first idea was to use old barges, old steel barges, and then to use that barge and to create a kind of platform out of it. And then on top of that barge, we will build a wooden structure, entirely prefabricated wooden structure, a grid of 6 by 6 meters. So we could make a 18 meter deep office space, which is ideal size for offices, and then create basically the offices in quite a fast tempo. And then it will be able to fit through the bridge. Now the problem with the steel barges is that you need to maintain them, and you need to basically take them out of the water every 7 years to entirely repaint all the steel. So what we did is that we actually came up with the idea to use concrete floating barges. Basically, you could say large floating concrete boxes. And because the concrete can stay in the water for at least 50 years, and it will, be totally fine, so you don't need to clean it. But the other beautiful thing about concrete is that it's extremely good in harnessing temperature. So we could use the concrete as a large heat exchanger. So basically like a super large cooling device in the water, which should always have the temperature of the water. So this is basically the design we made. It's, as I said, it's a very simple design, but it's really about maximizing efficiency, but also generating extremely generous qualities of the interior. So the beauty of the 6 by 6 meter grid is that you can create large windows of 6 meters wide and 3 meters high in one piece of glass. And all the sheets of glass can be the same, so it's all repetitioning. And then we can use the pitched roof. That's why it has this shape, because the long side is fully on the south. And we can use it to create 800 square meters of solar panels, which in its totality can generate 140% of the energy that we need for a building. So basically, that's how we engineered it. Within 3 months, we started building, and we built it in around 12 months. And this was also the first building that we were not using a main contractor. So we were, as a red company, we were also the contractor of the building. So we were designing it, developing it, we were also building it, and also we were financing it, and we also remained the owner of the building. Here you can see all the details we made, and basically the idea of the prefabrication, how to, basically create a large, prefabricated construction set that you just simply need to assemble on site. And the interesting thing is that because we use wood, the building is actually in itself carbon negative. So there's more carbon stored in the wood than is used to create it, despite the concrete and despite the steel and despite the glass. And of course the building, as I said, is also entirely energy positive. And here's a short movie about the production process. So here you can see these concrete barges. They were made in 3 different locations and then all assembled together into one large floating foundation. And this was all done in the north of Holland. And then the foundation itself was dragged to Rotterdam. And it just fit through the bridge, as you can see. It was very, very tight. And then on top of that foundation, we assembled all the wood construction from the middle out. So we started in the middle and then built it to the sides in order to balance. And all the wood was actually done within 11 weeks. And then we had all these prefabricated elements such as the stairs. And you can see I really like big stairs. You've seen other designs as well, I like big stairs. And of course a huge piece of glass. They were all basically the same size. It was a fantastic way of building. And it was also quite beautiful because we were totally able to control the entire process. Also, it was interesting that we couldn't really complain to anyone. Normally, you can complain about the contractor, but we couldn't complain about the contractor. And here it's almost finished. And there it is. Very dramatic music. And then it was finished. It was opened, of course, by Ban Ki-moon and the King of the Netherlands and the President of the World Bank. So that was a fantastic event. And we still actually have a lot of world leaders coming to the project, and I always give them a tour, which is fantastic to do. So here you can see it floating, and as I said, it's actually going up and down 2 meters every day because of the tidal river. Yeah, and it's a project that is also very has a very nice feeling to it because of the dry construction of the wood. It is at delivery already. It was almost entirely dust-free. There's a very good humidity, not this kind of super dry. You can have in a concrete building, where basically everything is always dry. Here it's actually a very nice climate, and also the large windows work extremely well. Because we had to build it so fast and we needed to rent out all the spaces, we also rented half of the space to our own office. So we also have our own office in that building. And we also made a swimming pool outside, so we can always go for a swim in the summer. And of course we can have the meeting rooms next to the pool, which is really great. So that was a floating office, and it was done, as I said, very much in this Rotterdam way of just doing it and acting and trying, and of course a lot of lessons learned from this project. There were quite a few things that we never expected. For instance, one of the things is that when you build on a floating foundation is that you cannot use lasers or lasers for measuring because it's always moving, so the lasers don't work. So you have to use the old-fashioned, winkelhaak, they call it in Dutch, like the old-fashioned measure instruments. And also a lot of it was done on site, on eyesight, to really just see if it's straight. And when the building was finished, we basically we calculated that the solar panels would be slightly heavier than the green roof on the other side, but when it's raining, the green roof actually became heavier, so the building was a bit hanging to the side. So we had to balance the boat with weight, we had to get it straight. But it's a fantastic building, and you can see that you can also jump from the terrace. Yeah. So the balconies are used as a springboard on Friday afternoons. And all the interns that work in our office, there's a tradition that when they leave, they anyway have to jump off. So that's a fantastic tradition. I very quickly want to show you one last project, which is Rise. Rise is basically our second big project in Rotterdam, and I think it combines a lot of the tactics, but also lessons that we've learned from our other development project we did in Rotterdam. And Rise is basically these 3 towers that you can see over there. And I love this picture because this tower in the front is called Het Witte Huis, also known as the White House. And when it was finished, it was finished in 1880. It was the tallest office building in Europe. And it was, I think, something like, 50 meters high. And it was, I think, for 30 years, it was the tallest office building in Europe. I always think that's such a brilliant thing. So I love that image because you see the kind of old Rotterdam ingenuity, and of course then whatever happened behind it. So Hofplein is basically one of the main entrances to the city. So here you have the city hall, and this is Hofplein. And what you can see is that, of course, here you have the river. Here is actually Codrico and the Rijnhaven, and this is the main shopping area. And Hofplein used to be the main entry into the city of Rotterdam, where the train station was, and it was an extremely lively area. Ella Fitzgerald played here, etc. So it was really extremely buzzing place. And also it had this kind of metropolitan scale. And you can see it was also, before the war, Rotterdam was also very much kind of 19th, 18th century city, still based on old modes of transportation. And after the war, the modernist city planners, they totally redrew the city, including Hofplein. And here you can actually see where the old Hofplein used to be, here on top. And they kind of moved the Hofplein to make this huge roundabout here with a fountain in the middle. Here's the city hall. And this Hofplein became, let's say, then the new main gate into the city of Rotterdam. Well, what also happened is that in the 60s, of course, they totally designed it in a modernist fashion with these large slabs you can see here as well, and this one as well. But in the 70s, this was actually done. So instead of creating this large, let's say, rectangular square, they kind of made this little corner, which has always been a kind of idiosyncratic part of that square. So 4 years ago, we acquired these two buildings as a developer because this building is also in the high-rise zone. And we made a deal together with the housing corporation here that we were going to redevelop this entire block. And the city of Rotterdam was quite enthusiastic about it because there's now 200 houses on that site. And if we would redevelop it, we would be able to create up to 1,500 housing units on that site and really massively densify that part of Rotterdam. And one of the strategies was to basically turn that corner into this corner in order to really create, finally finish, let's say, the master plan of the 60s and to bring some kind of balance to this really quite diverse part of Rotterdam in terms of architecture. So this is basically, you could say, the urban logic to recreate the square and to also then basically, instead of having this huge roundabout with traffic, to actually reduce the traffic enormously and maneuver all the cars around the square and create a big park in the middle with a fountain in the park, which was, I think, also a very bold move. So basically going from this building into this kind of quite classical setup of slabs and a block behind it, and then blending that into the fabric of Rotterdam. And here you can see the new city square, so quite similar as the plan in the Rijnhaven, where they add a lot of green. Here also they're adding a lot of green in the middle of the city while reducing the amount of cars. And then in order to really densify on that part, we added 3 towers to these blocks, because actually the Hofplein is the area in Rotterdam where you can build up to 300 meters high. And yeah, we thought it would be quite interesting to try to achieve that. So these were, let's say, the first volume studies we did, basically on the programming. And then, of course, we had to do a lot of research on all the different sunspots, because with these towers you add a lot of shade to the city. But we managed within the shapes of the towers to really stay within the amount of shading required. And we spent quite countless hours in the wind tunnel, researching all the effects of the wind on the urban space and making sure that all the area is actually capable of being, let's say, a very good urban quality. So now basically the project is almost ready for application. I think next week it will be addressed in the city. What's also quite interesting, that all the plinths of the building that are now entirely closed when you're there, they will be entirely programmed. So there will be cafes, shops and restaurants, and also there will be a kindergarten, there will be a doctor's station, offices, hotel, housing, social housing, mid-rent income housing. So it really became a total mix of a lot of different functions. And then it will play its role in the skyline. As the city is increasing quite tremendously around that node, because it's right on the metro station and it's, I think, a 5-minute walk from the central station. It will be one of the big markers in Rotterdam. So that's actually the Hofplein. And you know what I think is interesting, and I want to kind of finish off with that, is that as I started with, Rotterdam is basically a city that always says geen woorden maar daden, no words but deeds. That's one of the slogans. The other slogan of Rotterdam is sterker door strijd, which means stronger through struggle, stronger through struggle. And what's quite interesting is that a lot of people associate themselves also with the modernity of Rotterdam, which you can see in this tattoo, is that the skyline and all the modern architecture is also tattooed on the people, so they really see it as part of their identity, that the city is constantly rebuilding itself, reinventing itself, and struggling itself through. I wanted to end with a kind of little thought, is that when you think about architects as developers, I think you could definitely see it as a kind of Faustian pact, do you sell your soul to the devil or not? I also think that a lot of people think that it's very schizophrenic to be an architect and a developer, because you're basically Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You're basically schizo. But for me, I think very much the development is for me very much like a Trojan horse. I believe profoundly that architecture can be inserted into anything, as I think you can see in many modern applications of the word architecture, and network architecture, or infrastructure architecture. I think that anything itself can be designed and reconfigured, and I think architects can generally be quite good at that. So I think venturing into different domains, such as, let's say, urban planning, or into domains of commercial architecture or real estate, I think can be extremely interesting, and it can really lead to a progression of struggle. As I say in Rotterdam, we grow through struggle. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.